Cody Warren was not supposed to chain the world that night. He was just supposed to watch the screens. He was 26 years old, thin, and always a little tired. He worked the night shift at a radio telescope array outside Flagstaff, Arizona. The job was quiet most of the time. He sat in a small room with humming machines and blinking lights, and he watched data come in from deep space. Most of it was noise, stars doing what stars do, gas clouds, radiation. Nothing interesting. Cody had learned to ignore most of it, the way a person learns to ignore the sound of rain after a while. That Tuesday night, he was on his third cup of bad coffee and watching a baseball rerun on his tablet when the alert light turned orange. He looked at it for a second. Orange meant something unusual. It did not mean something impossible. And he had seen orange lights before, and they always turned out to be nothing. A satellite bounce, a glitch. The filter, static, shaped like a signal. He set down his coffee and pulled up the data on the main screen, ready to clear it and go back to his game. He did not go back to his game. What he saw on that screen made him sit very still. The signal was not noise. He knew noise. Noise was random. Noise had no shape. What he was looking at had shape. It repeated. Every 12 seconds it came back. Exactly the same, and inside it, buried in the frequency changes, was a pattern. Numbers, not random numbers, a sequence of prime numbers, clean and clear, like someone had written them out carefully and sent them across the dark. Cody ran the filter again, then a third time. The signal did not go away. It stayed exactly where it was, repeating its 12-second loop, patient and quiet and very, very real. He picked up the phone and called his supervisor. Dr. Laura Kinsey arrived 40 minutes later. She still had her jacket on from the drive. She stood behind Cody and looked at the screen for a long time, without saying a word. Laura had spent 15 years at this job. She had looked at a lot of screens. She had seen things that excited her, things that confused her, things that turned out to be nothing. But she had never felt her hands go cold before. They went cold now. Pull up the spectral analysis, she said. Her voice was very quiet. Cody pulled it up. The peaks on the graph were clear and sharp. This was not a pulsar. It was not a magnetar. It was not any natural thing that the universe made on its own, and the structure was too clean. The repetition was too exact. And then there was that third layer of the signal, something beyond the prime numbers, something that neither of them had the tools to read yet, but that both of them understood without saying it out loud. Was a message. Call Director Calloway, Laura said. Wake him up. Pete Calloway was in his car and driving toward Flagstaff before the sun came up. By morning, 2 other observatories on different continents had confirmed the signal. By afternoon, certain people in certain buildings in Washington were having very serious conversations. By the next day, the signal was classified, and a small, quiet group of people had been pulled together inside a facility in Colorado that did not appear on any public list of government buildings. Now the group was called something that sounded like a committee that managed procurement contracts. Nobody outside a very narrow circle knew what it actually was. It was led by a woman named Grace Foster, a retired Navy admiral who had spent the last 10 years thinking about problems that most people did not know existed. She was sharp and steady, and She did not waste words. She read the first analysis report over. A single cup of tea. How old is the signal? She asked. Dr. Neil Bassett, the astrophysicist they had brought in from a university in California, chose his words carefully. He was a precise man. He did not like to say things he could not prove. The point of origin appears to be about 400 light-years away, he said, so the signal is at least 400 years old. It left wherever it came from roughly 400 years ago, and it has been traveling through space ever since. And what does it say? Neil paused. We believe it is a distress call, he said. The structure of the signal, the mathematical framework it is built on, the way the layers are arranged, all of it points to something that was designed to be found, designed to communicate one basic thing. We are here. We are in trouble, please come. Grace set down her tea and looked at the window for a moment. Someone sent this 400 years ago, she said, and they have been waiting ever since. Yes, Neil said. Then we should not make them wait any longer, she said. The team worked fast after that. The signal was pulled apart piece by piece. Every layer was studied, mapped, translated as much as it could be. What they found, and it slowly, over days of careful work, was a picture, not a photograph, more like a story told in math and frequency and pattern. A civilization had existed somewhere 400 light-years away. It had been alive and working and building things. And then something had happened to it. Something had come. The signal did not describe what came clearly, but it described the result clearly enough. Everything had been taken. Everything had gone quiet. And in the last moments before the quiet, someone had built this signal and sent it out in every direction, hoping that someone somewhere would hear it. The signal had been traveling for 400 years. It had passed through the dark, between stars, through cold and silence, and the long empty spaces where nothing lives so, and it had finally reached the small blue planet that had only recently learned to listen. Grace Foster looked at the full report. On a Thursday evening, she read it from the first page to the last. Then she closed the folder and sat with it for a while. The people on her team were nervous. They asked the right questions. Was it a trap? Was it genuine? What kind of civilization could build something like this? What had happened to them? What was still out there? Grace heard all of those questions. They were good questions. She would make sure they were all answered eventually. But underneath all of them, she kept coming back to one simple thing. Someone had asked for help. They had sent their message out into the dark. And they had waited. 400 years of waiting. She did not know if any of them were still alive. She did not know what they looked like, or how they thought, or what their world had been like before the trouble came. She knew almost nothing about them. She knew they had asked for help. That was enough. She picked up her pen and started writing the order that would begin the next phase of the operation. It was a long order with many parts, but the first line was short and very simple. It said, "We are going to answer." The signal had not only reached Earth, this was the thing that changed everything, and it came out 11 days after the first alert light turned orange in Cody Warren's monitoring room. Buried inside the signal itself, like a return address written in mathematics, was a channel, a narrow frequency band, almost too quiet to notice, that carried something else entirely. Not the distress message, something newer. A something that had been placed there by someone who was already watching, already waiting, already counting who responded and how. The humans found it by accident. One of the analysts, a young woman named Dana Cole, who had been working 20-hour days since the signal was classified, noticed a faint secondary pattern in the data and flagged it without being sure what it was. A full team spent 3 days on it before they understood the channel was a relay. Someone had built it into the signal as a two-way door. Receive the message and the door opens. Respond and someone on the other end hears you. Grace Foster was briefed on this at 6:00. In the morning, she sat with the information for exactly 4 minutes, and then she told the team to respond. The reply came back in 9 hours. That alone was staggering, and 9 hours meant the relay was not dependent on the speed of light in the normal way. It was something else, some technology that the humans could not explain yet, but that worked. A voice of sorts came back through the channel, structured, patient, and clearly not human. The being on the other end called itself a Valori, or rather that was the closest sound the human linguists could shape out of what came through. Dr. Irene Shaw, the linguist who had been brought onto the team 2 days after the signal was confirmed, sat with the audio for 6 straight hours before she had anything she could bring back to Grace. They knew we were here, Irene said. They have known for some time. They were watching to see if we would hear the signal, and they were watching to see what we would do with it. How many others heard it? Grace asked. And Irene looked at her notes. 43 star systems received the signal. 11 of those had civilizations capable of receiving it. 7 of those 11 have been in contact with the Valori for centuries. They are part of a council, an organization of old, advanced civilizations that have been cooperating for a very long time. And the other 4? Grace asked. 3 of them heard the signal and chose not to respond, Irene said. The risk was too high, they decided. The unknown was too dangerous. They received it and they went quiet. And the 4th, Grace said. She already knew the answer. That is us. Irene said. We are the only ones who answered, and according to the Valori, we answered faster than any civilization they have ever observed. We responded immediately, and our response included coordinates and an offer to travel there in person. There was a silence in the room. Outside, through the small frosted window, the Colorado sky was gray and low. They think we are strange, Grace said. It was not a question. They think we are potentially dangerous, Irene said carefully. But yes, they also think we are strange. The Valori called a council meeting. All 7 of the civilizations that were part of their organization sent representatives. The question on the table was simple. Should humanity be allowed to participate in any mission to the origin of the signal? The debate that came back through the relay over the following days was, in Grace's private opinion, one of the most frustrating things she had ever listened to, and she had sat through congressional hearings. The Thistle, a species from a tidally locked world, who moved slowly and deliberated on everything for a very long time, said that humanity was too young, too unpredictable, too likely to act before thinking. They had been studying the radio and light signals leaking out of Earth's atmosphere for decades, and what they had found was a record of wars, conflicts, and a species that had not yet learned how to solve its problems without violence. The Drevi, who communicated in layered musical tones and had not fought a war in over 4,000 years, agreed with the Thistle. They were gentle about it, polite, but their meaning was clear. Humans were not ready. Humans were, in the Drevi's careful phrasing, still in an early and difficult phase of their development. The Qweth, a hive-minded thought, collectively and spoken averaged consensus, ran the numbers and stated flatly that including humanity in any response mission increased risk by a margin that did not justify their involvement. There were a few voices in humanity's favor. A species called the Marini, who were described in Irene's notes as somewhere between curious and reckless by the standards of the Council, argued loudly that the humans should be allowed to come. Their reason was not complicated. They are the only ones who were not afraid, the Marini representative said. That is worth something. The Valori themselves were torn. They had been watching humanity's response closely, and they could not decide if what they were seeing was courage or recklessness, or simply a species too young to understand what it was walking toward. The Council voted. The result was clear. Humanity was not to participate, and Grace Foster read the translated result on a Wednesday morning. She read it twice. She set it down on the table. Then she picked up her pen and began writing a reply. The reply took 2 hours to finish and 3 more to translate properly. When it was done, Irene read it back to Grace to make sure the tone was right. It was polite, it was respectful, it acknowledged the Council's concerns one by one carefully, without dismissing any of them. And then it said that clears throat. Humanity was going anyway, not as an act of aggression, not as a challenge to the Council's authority, simply as a statement of fact. The signal had asked for help. Humanity had heard it. Humanity was going to respond. Council was welcome to observe, to advise, to come along if they chose, but the decision had been made, and it was not going to be unmade. And Irene sent the reply through the relay and then sat back in her chair and looked at Grace. They are going to be upset, Irene said. Yes, Grace agreed. They might see this as exactly the kind of behavior they were worried about. They might, Grace said. She paused. But 400 years ago, someone asked for help, and every civilization that was old enough and wise enough and careful enough to know better decided the risk was too high. And now here we are 400 years later, and nobody has gone. She stood up from the table. I would rather be the savage who showed up than the wise one who stayed home. Irene looked at her for a moment, then she nodded. The relay carried the message out into the dark. Somewhere very far away, a council of ancient and careful civilizations received it and began arguing all over again. But this time the argument did not matter. The humans were already planning a ship. The ship was called the Aldridge. It was not the most beautiful thing humanity had ever built. It was not the most advanced either. But it was the fastest crewed vessel that Earth's engineers could put together in 11 months, which was exactly the amount of time Grace Foster had decided they had before the Council found a way to formally block them. 11 months was a very short time to build a ship meant to travel 400 light years. The engineers worked in 3 shifts. Around the clock, they argued constantly, and slept badly and drank too much coffee and built something that most of them privately thought was slightly insane. The drive assembly alone took 7 months. It was based on principles that had been sitting in theoretical papers for 20 years and had never been tested at this scale. When they ran the first full power test, half the team was holding their breath, and the other half was covering their eyes. It worked. Grace Foster picked the crew personally. She took her time with it. She was not looking for the best pilots or the most decorated scientists, though she found some of those too. She was looking for people who could handle not knowing, people who could sit inside a problem that had no clear answer and keep functioning, people who would not freeze. The commander was Drew Alderman. He was 44 years old, calm in a way that came from experience rather than personality. He had led a research expedition to the Antarctic, a deep-sea mission that had gone wrong in 3 separate ways, and a classified operation that Grace could not put in the file but that she knew about. He did not panic. He made decisions. He lived with them. Dr. Maya Akefer was the mission xenobiologist. She was 38, and she had spent her career studying life that survived in places life was not supposed to survive. Boiling vents on the ocean floor, ice sheets in Antarctica, acidic lakes where nothing should be able to breathe. She had a habit of talking quietly too, whatever she was examining, which her colleagues found odd until they realized it was just how she thought out loud. She was the right person to meet, something that had never been met before. Lieutenant Commander Ben Hollis handled systems and operations. He was 41 and he had a quick, dry sense of humor that came out at exactly the right moments and exactly the wrong ones. He was also one of the most competent systems operators Grace had ever seen, which was why she put up with the humor. Dr. Irene Shaw came from the translation team. She was 35 and she had been working on the Valori language for months. By the time she boarded the Aldridge, she had developed what she called a feel for the way the Valori thought, not just the words they used, but the ideas underneath the words. That kind of understanding was going to matter more than any other skill on this mission. Lieutenant Felix Ordega was the pilot. He was 30 years old and had grown up in San Antonio. He had a photograph of his grandmother taped to the panel above his navigation screen. He put it there on the first day, and nobody said anything about it because it seemed like exactly the right thing to have on a trip like this. Dr. Sam Kelly was the mission doctor. He was 50, the oldest person on the crew, with a slow and unhurried way of speaking that made alarming things sound manageable. This was either a gift or a problem, depending on the situation. The crew had already decided it was mostly a gift. They launched on a clear morning in October. Nobody outside a very specific list of people knew it happened. The journey was long, the drive covered distance in a way that the engineers could measure but not entirely explain. And the crew occupied the time the only way they could. They ran drills. They reviewed every document the task force had produced about the signal and the council in the world called Vashera, at which was the closest human pronunciation of the name in the original message. Irene ran language sessions every day, teaching the others the basic harmonic patterns of Valori communication. working on the fragments of Vasherin that the team back home had managed to reconstruct from the signal. Drew read everything. He read the signal analysis. He read the council transcripts. He read the reports on what the signal described, what had happened to Vashara, what might still be there. The picture that came together was not a comfortable one. Vashara had been a real place, a real civilization. It had been part of the council's predecessor organization for centuries. It had been, by all available records, a peaceful species, careful and creative, and long established. And then, approximately 400 years ago, something had arrived in their system. The signal did not describe the thing. Clearly, it described what the thing did. It took everything methodically, thoroughly, without apparent emotion or negotiation. It came and it took and it left, and the Vasherins, in the last moments before everything went quiet, had built their signal and sent it out into every direction they could reach. One evening, about 3 weeks into the journey, the crew ate together in the common module. It happened most evenings. The food was not remarkable, but eating together was something none of them wanted to give up. Ben was the one who said what all of them had been thinking. The council has ships, he said, real ships, old ships built by civilizations that have been traveling between stars for centuries. Why did none of them go? Nobody answered right away, but Irene set down her fork. The council works on consensus, she said. Every major decision requires agreement from all members, not majority, all of them, and they have been arguing about the appropriate response to the Vasherin signal for 400 years without reaching full agreement. Felix looked up from his food. 400 years, he said quietly. They are very old civilizations, Irene said. She was not judging them. She was just explaining. Old civilizations have seen what happens when someone acts too fast, without thinking it through, without getting everyone on board. They have learned to be careful. They have built whole systems around being careful, and those systems work most of the time. But not this time, Maya said. Not this time, Irene agreed, because this time being careful meant doing nothing. And doing nothing for 400 years looks exactly like doing nothing. Sam Kelly picked up his cup and looked into it for a moment. We haven't learned to be that careful yet, he said. No, Drew said, we haven't. Nobody said anything else for a while. Felix looked at the photograph of his grandmother above the nav screen. Maya turned her cup slowly in her hands. Ben stared at the table. Outside the ship, the stars were very far apart, and the space between them was very dark and very quiet. The Aldridge moved through it steadily, carrying 6 people who had decided that 400 years was long enough for someone to wait. They came out of the drive at the edge of the Vasherin system, and the first thing the sensors showed them was silence. Not the silence of empty space. Space was never truly empty and never truly silent, and not to the right instruments. What the sensors showed them was the silence of a place where something had been and was no longer. Drew Alderman sat in the command seat and looked at the readings for a long moment before he spoke. Run the full scan, he said. Ben Hollies ran it. The results came back slowly, layer by layer, and none of them were what anyone had hoped. The star was still there, a warm orange-yellow sun burning steadily, doing what stars do, not caring about anything that had happened. In the system around it, the two outer planets were still in their orbits, cold and undisturbed, but the inner system was different. The third planet, the one that matched the coordinates in the signal, was present. It was still there, but its surface showed nothing. No city lights, no heat signatures from industry or power generation. I'd no radio signals, no movement of any kind that could be distinguished from the natural movement of wind and water and geology. It looked like a world that had gone very quiet. I am reading debris patterns in the inner system, Ben said. His voice was steady. They are old. Distribution matches roughly 400 years, and the pattern is not random. This is not the debris of an explosion or a collision. The spacing is too even, too organized. What does that mean? Felix asked from the pilot's seat. It means whatever was here was removed, Ben said. Piece by piece. Systematically. Nobody said anything for a moment. Irene was already at the communications array. She was sending the greeting signal, and the one she and the translation team had built over months, a careful arrangement of harmonic patterns drawn from the VLORI framework but shaped with elements pulled directly from the Vacheron signal. It was a message that said, in the closest thing to Vacheron that she could manage, we heard you, we came. We are not a threat. She set it on a loop and let it run. Life signs? Drew asked. Maya was at the bioscan. She had been running it since the moment they arrived, and she did not look up. Working on it, she said. The surface readings are clean, nothing obvious. But I am going deeper. The Aldridge moved carefully into the inner system. Felix flew it slow and steady, keeping well clear of the debris fields. Now, watching the proximity alerts with the focus calm of someone who understood that a rock the size of a refrigerator at the wrong speed was not something to be casual about. The planet grew larger in the forward cameras. It was a green and gray and brown world with patches of blue. It had oceans. It had what looked like a thick atmosphere. From a distance it was not so different from Earth. Drew found that made it feel worse. Somehow. Not better. I have something, Maya said. Everyone turned to her. It is faint, she said carefully. Very faint. Northern continent, deep subsurface. I am reading heat signatures, biological, not geological. They are small and they are irregular, and they are spread over a large area underground. She looked up. Something is alive down there. Drew made the decision in less than a minute, and he would take the lander down with Maya and Irene. Ben, Felix, and Sam would hold the Aldridge in orbit and keep every sensor they had pointed at the space around the system. If something came back, he wanted to know about it fast. Sam Kelly handed Drew a medical kit before they boarded the lander. You do not know what you are walking into, Sam said in his quiet way. No, Drew agreed. Come back, Sam said. It was not a dramatic thing. He said it the way someone says, take an umbrella. The lander touched down on a high plateau above a valley that had once clearly been a city. The structures were still there. That was the thing that hit Drew first. They had not been destroyed. They were standing, many of them in long, quiet rows with streets between them that were now cracked and overgrown with pale vegetation. No windows were broken, no walls had fallen. It looked less like a ruin and more like a place that had simply been emptied carefully and left to sit. Irene activated the external broadcast array on the lander, and the greeting signal went out again, louder this time, filling the air around the plateau. Drew stood at the hatch with Maya beside him and looked at the city below and listened to wind, the sound of dry vegetation moving, distant sound that might have been water. They waited. After 2 hours, something moved. It came from the rubble at the far edge of the plateau, slow and careful, stopping often, checking the air in a way that suggested long practice at moving without being noticed. It was small, roughly a meter tall, with a broad, flat face and large, overlapping membranes where ears would have been on a human. Its skin was a dark gray-green, and its eyes were wide and very still. It stopped about 30 m from the lander and stood there, not advancing, not retreating, simply watching. Irene stepped forward and spoke the greeting in Vasharan. Not perfectly. She knew it was not perfect, but it was as close as months of work had gotten her, and she put everything she had into the tone of it. The being was completely still for several seconds. Then it made a sound. Irene's translation system was not built for Vasharan specifically. It was built for the family of harmonic languages that the Valerie framework covered, and Vasharan was distant from that family, like a cousin 3 times removed, but the sound the being made was close enough to something in the system that a word came back to her, uncertain and partial. See, like a voice heard through a wall. The word was finally. More of them came after that. Slowly over the next hours, others emerged from openings in the rock and rubble around the plateau. Not dozens, not hundreds. Carefully, 1 or 2 at a time, they came out and stood at a distance and looked at the 3 humans standing beside their lander. Some of them were very small. Some of them were old. All of them moved with the careful quietness of beings who had spent a very long time learning not to be seen. Drew looked at them and thought about the signal. He thought about 400 years of waiting in the dark underground, not knowing if anyone would come, not knowing if the message had been received, not knowing if the thing that had taken everything would come back. He thought about what it would take to keep going through that, to keep building something sustainable in the underground, to keep sending people up, to watch the entrance day after day, year after year, generation after generation. He thought that these people were, in their own quiet way, extraordinary. Irene was working through the translation carefully, slowly, building a conversation, one careful word at a time. Drew turned to her and asked the question that had been sitting in him since they arrived. Ask them how many survived, he said. Irene asked. The Vasharan who had come first, the one who had watched them longest, answered in a long, quiet sequence of sounds. Irene listened and translated. More than 200,000, she said. They are spread across 8 underground networks. On 3 continents, they have been there for generations. Drew looked at the empty city below the plateau, then and then at the beings standing in the pale afternoon light of a sun they had not seen freely in 400 years. Tell them, he said, that they do not have to hide anymore. The Valerie ship arrived on the 19th day. Drew was on the surface when it happened. He had been spending most of his time down on the plateau, working with Irene and the growing group of Vashurans who were slowly becoming willing to talk. Sam had come down on the fourth day and set up a small medical station at the edge of the plateau, and he had been busy every day since. The Vashurans were healthy by and large. They had built something real and sustainable in the underground. But they were cautious in the way of beings who had learned very early and very hard that the universe could take everything from you without warning. The Ben called down from the Aldrich to tell Drew about the Valerie ship. Then, within 48 hours, 3 more council ships arrived, then 2 more, then a vessel that Irene identified by its harmonic signature as Marani, which she flagged to Drew with a short note that said she thought the Marani had probably been hoping the humans would succeed. Drew received the Valerie representative via relay from the Aldrich. The representative's name translated loosely as something like High Listener, which was apparently a title rather than a name. High Listener was not hostile, but it was not entirely comfortable either. It communicated in the careful, layered way of someone who had prepared very thoroughly for a conversation it was not sure how to have. You came without permission, High Listener said. Yes, Drew said. You were specifically told not to come. Yes, Drew said again, a pause. And yet you came. There were people here who needed help, Drew said. We came. Another pause, longer this time. We are aware, High Listener said. Finally, that there were people here. We have been aware for 400 years. Drew thought about how to answer that. He looked at the plateau, at the Vashurans moving carefully in the pale morning light, at the empty city in the valley below, at the long, quiet streets, and the standing structures, and all the things that had been emptied out and left. He thought about 200,000 people in underground caves for 400 years. Then you were aware for 400 years that they were waiting, he said. And you did not come. High Listener did not answer immediately. When it did, and it said something that Irene translated carefully and handed to Drew in written form because she wanted him to have the exact words it said. We were not sure it was safe. Drew folded the paper and put it in his pocket and did not say anything else to High Listener that day. Back on Earth, Grace Foster had been watching the council sessions that were being relayed to the Colorado facility. The sessions had been running since before the Aldrich arrived at Vashera, and they had intensified considerably after the ship dropped out of the drive and began transmitting data. The whole council was paying very close attention now. The debate had shifted. That was the thing Grace noticed. 400 years of deliberation over whether to respond at all had given way to a very different conversation. The new question was not whether to respond. Humanity had made that question irrelevant by simply going. The new question was what to do about humanity. The Thistle still had concerns. They were careful to note that the humans had acted recklessly, that they had ignored the formal decision of a council with 900 years of operational history, that this kind of unilateral action was exactly the sort of behavior that made them a difficult species to incorporate into any long-term cooperative framework. The Dravi agreed, though gently. The principles were important. The principles existed for good reasons. If every young civilization that received the Council's decisions simply ignored them and acted alone, the framework would fall apart. The Queth stated that the outcome did not justify the process, but something had changed in the room. Grace could hear it even through the translation, even through the layers of linguistic and cultural distance. The other voices were quieter than they had been. The objections were still there, but they carried less weight. The weigh-in argument carries less weight when everyone in the room can see that the person arguing it knows they are on the wrong side of something. The Valerie said something that Grace replayed 3 times. We have been part of this council for 900 years, the Valerie representative said, and in that time we have built 17 different frameworks for deciding when and how to act. Each framework was built because the previous one failed in some way. Each one is better than the last, and none of them would have reached a decision about Vashara in anything less than another 100 years. A pause. Other humans had no framework. They heard that someone needed help. They went. Is that not the definition of recklessness? Someone asked. It is also, the Valerie said, reason there are Vashoran survivors. Irene presented to the full council from Vashara orbit. She had prepared carefully. She spoke in Valerie harmonic language, which she had been learning for months, and the council had not expected a human to manage it. She spoke about what they had found on the surface. She spoke about the underground networks, the 200,000 survivors, the generations of waiting, the careful, quiet endurance of a species that had refused to give up even when giving up would have been the easiest thing in the world. Then she said, you deliberated for 400 years, and we understand why. As you have built something patient and careful and lasting, and those are real and good things, but the Vashorans did not need patient and careful. They needed someone to come. You were not wrong to think carefully. You were wrong to think carefully instead of acting. Those are different mistakes. The council voted on humanity's formal inclusion. The motion was put forward by the Marani representative, who did it with what Irene described as barely contained enthusiasm. The vote was unanimous. Grace Foster, watching the result come in from Colorado, sat very still for a long moment. She had been told that the council had not voted unanimously on anything in over 200 years. Drew wrote his mission log the night before the Aldridge began its journey home. He sat in the common module with a cup of tea that Sam had made him, and he wrote plainly and carefully, without trying to make anything sound more than it was. He wrote about the signal. He wrote about the crew. He wrote about Vishara and the empty city and the plateau and the day the first Visharan came out of the rubble and stood in the light and looked at 3 humans from a small blue planet who had traveled 400 light years because someone had asked for help. He wrote about the underground networks and the 200,000 survivors and what it must have taken to last that long and still be willing in the end to step back into the open. At the end, he wrote one line that he had been carrying in his head for days. He wrote, they called us savage, maybe. They were not entirely wrong. But I think they forgot that the ones willing to walk into the dark are always the ones who were not afraid of it. Felix Ortega flew them home. The photograph of his grandmother was still above his screen. Outside the viewport, the stars were very old and very far apart. The Aldridge moved between them, steadily carrying 6 people who had Gone somewhere no one else had been. Willing to go and found something still alive there that had been waiting a very long time. They were going home. And behind them, on a plateau above an empty city, the Vesharans were learning, slowly and carefully, how to live in the light again.